So this week, Parshas Vayeitzei, we will be discussing probably one of the most fundamental and important mitzvahs we have, and that is the mitzvah of Tefillah. Zui ha'avodah shebelev, zu Tefillah, the Gemara says in Tanis Daf Beis Omed Aleph. And to this week, at the very beginning of the Parsha, the three avos and their three tefillahs come to a conclusion and a climax. Vayivga b'mokem vayolin sham ein pegia ela loshen tefillah. And the Gemara says in Parshas Chavav Amid Beis, tefillahs avos tiknum. Avraham tiken shachris, Yitzchak tiken mincha, Yaakov tiken arves. So the three fundamental tefillahs that every Jew davens every day were put into place by the Ovis Hagdoshim. Avraham shachris, Yitzchak mincha, Yaakov arves, Vayivga b'mokem. So in Parshas Chavav Amid Beis there's a machlokes, two different opinions. What are the three different tefillahs of every day? And one says the Ovis Hagdoshim. Each of them put one of the three tefillahs into place, and the other says Keneged Tmidim Tiknum, that the three tefillahs are associated with the karbonos of each and every day. Tomit Shel Shachar, Tomit Shel Beinu Arbayim, Shachas and Mincha, and the Avarim of the Tomit Shel Beinu Arbayim were put on the Mizbeach and consumed by the fire of the Mizbeach all night, and that is Tefillas Arvis. So, contrary to the first two tefillahs, which are obligatory, which are a chayva, Tefillas Arvis reshus, and that's a machlokes Tanoim, Daf Chav Zayin and Mesechet Brachos, and the halacha is Tefillas Arvis reshus, and that coincides with the opinion that the three tefillahs are associated with the karbonos. Tomit Shel Shachar, Tomit Shel Beinu Arbayim are karbonos chayva; they are obligatory. But the Avarim that are consumed by the Mizbeach all night, it is preferable that we do that by day. But usually there wasn't enough time, and therefore the Avarim are burning all night. But that is a reshus, and not a chayva, and therefore tefillas arvis reshus. The Rambam in Perek Tes of Hilchos Malachim writes, Avraham hispalel arvis, Yitzchak hoisev oy tefillah, v'Yankev Avraham hispalel shachris, Yitzchak hoisev oy tefillah, v'Yankev hispalel arvis. So the interpretation of the Rambam, when Chazal say Avraham tiken shachris, Yitzchak tiken mincha, Yaakov tiken arvis, usually tiken is a loshen takana. So it would seem to be that the others were metaken for their descendants, the Doiros Olam, that one should daven shachris mincha marav. But according to the Roshon of the Rambam, the kavana is merely that Avraham daven shachris and Yitzchak did so in mincha time and Yaakov daven arvis, but they didn't have in mind to be metaken at the takana for others, and definitely not for coming generations. The Marsha, and the Marsha is one of the biggest meforshim, one of the choshes to meforshim, but rarely does he quote the Rishonim. The derech limit of the Marsha seems to be like he learned Gemara Rashi Tosfos and he wrote whatever he had to say, and he almost never quotes the Rambam. But the Marsha medated the Nafshei, the Marsha on his own writes that when Chazal say Avraham tiken shachris, Yitzchak tiken mincha, Yaakov tiken arvis, ain't kavanas advorim that they made takonis or decrees, but rather it is from them that we learn that a good Jew should daven shachris, mincha, and marav, and that is why Chazal used the loshen, used the terminology tiken, but they actually weren't metaken for others. They just davened, and the Mashal we would expect to quote the Rambam, because the Rambam says exactly that. So this is just regarding the concept of the Ovis Hagdoshim that were metaken tefillas. So tefillas arvis reshus, that is the halacha. And Tosfos, many times in Shas, Tosfos appears in Brochas, Daled Amid Beis, Chovav Amid Aleph, Lamed Amid Beis, Shabbos Daf Tes, Yom Pei Zayin, Chagigah. In many places in Shas, Tosfos ask a very fundamental question. The Gemara says, if you didn't say Yalav Yovai by night, then you don't need to daven Shemoneh Esrei again, because Ein Mekashen Es HaChodesh B'Laylo. Which, if not the Svora Ein Mekashen Es HaChodesh B'Laylo, obviously one would need to daven again. But if the entire Tefillah service is Rishus, then he had no real chiyuv to daven in the first place. Why would he need to daven again? And in Tosfos we find two different terutzim, two different answers to this fundamental question. First, Tosfos writes, even though Chazal say Tefillah service Rishus, it is a Rishus compared to Tefillas Chayva, but it's not mamish a Rishus. It is a Rishus, it is not the level of obligation of Shachris and Mincha, but it still is obligatory. But it is nidche mepnei mitzvah oiveres. If you have another mitzvah to perform, other mitzvahs will become before Tefillas Arvis, but Tefillas Arvis is not Rishus mamish. It is a Chayva, but the level of Chiyuv is not the same as Shachris or Mincha. That is one answer in Tosfos, and therefore, if not the Svara, Ein Mekatchen as a Chodesh B'Layla, we would say that you need to daven again. The other teretz, Tosfos quotes in the name of the Bahag, of the Alochas Gedolos. Originally, Tefillah service is Rishus. Shaviu alayhu choivo, or kiblu aleihem choivo. So even though mitzad Chazal, Tefillah service would be totally Rishus, and there would be no choiva at all, it's voluntary and not obligatory. However, kiblu aleihem choivo. And it is clear in the Rishonim that there are two different mahalchim, two different interpretations. What does it mean, kiblu aleihem choivo? Is it personal, or is it klal Yisrael, kiblu aleihem choivo? The Rambam in Hilchos Tefillah Perek Aleph Halacha Vav seem clearly to say, and the Rambam says, if I would have a Rambam Ahavo, it would be helpful. I think some people know where the Rambam is here. So the Rambam, in Perek Aleph of Hilchos Tefillah Halacha Vav, the Rambam clearly says if there is a smaller Rambam, it would be preferable. So Hilchos Tefillah Perek Aleph Halacha Vav v'chein hitkinu sheyehei odem mispalel tefillah achas b'layla שהרי איברי תומד של בינו ארבעים מתעכלים והולכים כל הלילה שנאמר היו אלוהים מוידו. ואין תפילת סרבס חייבו כתפילת שחרס ומנחה. ואף על פי כן נהגו כל ישראל בכל מקומות מושבותיהם להספלל ערבס וקיבלו עליהם כתפילת חייבו. So the Rambam, when he brings this idea, clearly says, נהגו כל ישראל בכל מושבותיהם להספלל ערבס וקיבלו עליהם כתפילת חייבו. So the Rambam, following the footsteps of the Rif, understands that the concept of Kibbul Aleim Choiva is not a personal one, but rather Minag Yisrael. Nahagu Kol Yisrael B'Kol Mishusayim L'Isparel Arvis. The Rosh and Tosfos seem to say, because you davened Ma'arav yesterday and the day before yesterday, then on the personal level, that is like a neder, and that is like Kibbul Aleim Choiva. And not only the fact that you davened Ma'arav previously, even tonight you davened Ma'arav, but you skipped Yalav Yavoy. And therefore, you took it upon yourself to daven Ma'arav, and that is obviously like a neder. And therefore, if not the Svora, Ein Mekatchen is a Chodesh B'Layla, we would say he needs to daven again. Because you davened first time, and that proves that you took it upon yourself to daven. And you davened every other night previously. So there are two different approaches. What does the Alochas Gedolos mean by Kiblu Aleim Choiva? Is it a Kabbalah Klolos of Klal Yisrael, as is obvious in the Rambam that we just read, or is it more a personal Kabbalah? Ben kach u ben kach. Bizmanenu, it is a Chiyuv Gomer to daven Ma'arav, just like the other Tefillas, either because originally it was a chiyuv, but not on the same level as other chiyuvim. Or is it a choiva mitzad minag Yisrael? In Mechasoshet Dvorim Simachov Hey, there's a lengthy discussion. How do we define and understand the mere concept of Kiblu Aleim Choiva? How could a person, something that is not a mitzvah, turn into a mitzvah? What is his power to do so? One approach would be just like any other neder, nidrei mitzvah. Nidrei mitzvah are binding. And even though Tefillah Shabbos is not a chayvo, but it definitely is a mitzvah. Whenever you daven, it's a mitzvah. According to the Rambam, a mitzvah d'oraisa of Avadat HaMesashem Elokechem. Even according to the Ramban, there's no chiyuv to daven every day, but it definitely is a mitzvah. It is a reflection, and probably the most important reflection of Avodas HaKel. And therefore, it is nidrei mitzvah. That would be one approach. And the other approach would be more, nidrei mitzvah is fitting if we say Kiblu Aleim Choiv is on the personal level. If you davened every day, it is as if you made a neder to daven. But according to the Rambam, that Klal Yisrael Kiblu Aleim Choivo, Nahagi Yisrael B'kol Meish V'seim L'Span Alarvis V'Kiblu Aleim Choivo, that would not be mitzad neder, but rather mitzad minag. And minag is binding. Minag is an important and integral part of Torah, as we find twice in Shas, and Chul and Sadi Gimel and Apsocham Dafnun, that a person is obligated to keep minhag Yisrael, and we learn that from a posuk in Mishlei, Al Titosh Torah Samechom. So according to the Rambam and the Rif, that the Kiblu Aleim Choiv was Nahagu Kol Yisrael B'Kol Meish V'seim, it would be Metoras Minag, and according to the Russian Toshas, that it is a personal Kabbalah, probably it would be Medin Neder. And the Rambam writes, what? The entire question of Chayvus Tefillah by women is a big discussion. The Magen Avraham and Simon Kuvav, as very well known, feels, the Magen Avraham writes, Nashadidan, don't daven. In the days of the Magen Avraham, women didn't daven. I think it is primarily the Mishnah Brura that brought Tefillah into it. It is Beis Yankov. Before from girls' schools, women didn't daven. My mother used to tell me in their home in Hungary, women didn't daven, and they relied on the Magen Avraham. The Magen Avraham says that the mitzvah d'Rabbanan of 3 tefillahs every day was only for men and not for women. But the minhag today in Beis Yankov is that women daven, but not Marav, because at the end of the day, Marav is Rishus. And obviously, Noshim lo kiblu aleihem chayva, because most generations, women didn't even daven at all. So the first 2 tefillahs, according to Mishnah Brura and many other poskim, it's a chiyuv. But tefillah Shabbos that originally was a Rishus, most women don't daven Marav. The concept of Kiblu Alehem Choivo we find in various different sources. Twice in Magen Avraham. Magen Avraham and Simon Tov, Kuf, Tzadik, Aleph, regarding Malchi is Zechroinoi Shoifros, and then Magen Avraham writes that the minhag Kol Yisrael is to say 10 psukim, and Kiblu Alehem Choivo. Magen Avraham Tov Peites is a big surprise that Magen Avraham writes that Noshim Kiblu Aleim Choiva Sfiras or Oimer, and usually Bnei Ashkenaz paskin in accordance to the Magen Avraham, but I don't think in any major Kehillah Bekahal Yisrael women were makbid to count Sfiras Oimer. I think only in Germany, only by the Yekes. In Poland and Galicia, women were makbid in Sfiras Oimer. And the Magen Avraham says in Tov Peites, Kiblu Aleihem Choiva. Nazir Shimshin is one of the Choshev Sforim and Shulchan Aruch HaChaim, and he argues Kiblu Aleim Choiva is only when there is a machlokes. Yesh machayvim, yesh poitrim. Even though the halacha is lakula, it's shaykh to say Kiblu Aleim Choiva lachmir kedasa machmirim. But no one says that women are chayim in Sfiras Oimer because the mitzvah says she's man grava, and therefore Kiblu Aleim Choiva would not apply. And it is not clear to me why would Kiblu Aleim Choiva only be relevant if there is a machlokes. If it's a neder, it's a neder, and it applies to every mitzvah, whether it is a machlokes or not. If it's a minhag, it is the same. So in my sefer, I questioned what is the logic, what's this word of the Nazir Shimshah and the Mechas Chidduch, let's say that Kibbutz Alayim Choiva is only valid, is only relevant if there's a Machlokes and we are Machmer Kedas HaMachmirim. So we find this concept in the Magen Avraham, Tov Peites regarding women by Svias Oima, Tov Kuf Tzadik Aleph regarding Malchi Zechroinos Shoifrois. We find Rabbi Kiva Eiger in the very first simon in Shuvas Rabbi Kiva Eiger, not in the Sefer, but rather in the Hashmotas and the Mafteches at the end of the Sefer. Rabbi Kiva Eiger writes, Noshim Kiblu Aleim Choiva Lulav Sukkah Shofar, which is once again a big chiddush. So B'nois Ashkenaz don't make a brocha on Natilas Lulav or on Sukkah, but to say Kiblu Aleim Choiva, women definitely eat chutz l'Sukkah. So Rabbi Kiva Eiger is a big chiddush. But we find the concept of Kiblu Aleim Choiva, as I just mentioned, in various different sources. The Rambam, on one hand, the Rambam writes, Kiblu Aleim Choiva, but we do find 3 halachas in the Rambam in which Tfilas Marav is different, stands apart, different than Shachas and Mincha, because Tfilas Arvis Rishus. Perek Gimel Halacha Zayin Hilchos Tfilah, the Rambam writes, because Tfilas Arvis Rishus, Ein Medaktekin Bizmana. We are very makbet. Tfilas Shachas should be Bizmana, after Neitzachamo till Dalet Shois. Tfilas Mincha, we're makbet, it should be Bizmana. Tfilas Ma'avis, because Tfilas Arvis Rishus, Ein Medaktekin Bizmana. And therefore the Rambam says, you are entitled to daven Marav early. Meplaga Mincha Velamala, even though Iker Zman Laila is Mitzvei Sakei. And the Rambam explains the halacha that we find in Brochas Daf Chavav. Rav Soli Shel Shabbos B'Yerev Shabbos. Rav made an early Shabbos. And he davened the Marav Shabbos Meba'od Yom before it says Sakei Chavim. Tosfos explains that is because of Tosefes Shabbos. But the Rambam, Perek Gimel, Halacha Zayin Hilchos Tfilah writes, because Tfilas Arvis Rishus, Ein Medaktekin Bizmano. Perek Tes Halacha Tes Hilchos Tfilah, the Rambam explains, because Tfilas Arvis Rishus, therefore there is no Chazoros Shatz. And the Rambam explains, why do we have Chazoros Shatz by Shachas and Mincha and we don't have Chazoros Shatz by Marav? Because originally, the Shliach Tzibur is all about Lahoitzi es Misha Einoi Boki. Many people weren't familiar with davening, and many times we think, Achshar Dora, are we a better generation than all the previous ones? In the days of Chazal, there were so many people that didn't know how to daven, and the Shliach Tzibur was moitzi all the people that didn't daven on their own. Today, everybody knows how to daven, and I say, I don't think we're the greatest generation. All those people that in days of yore came to shul and they didn't know how to daven, today they are the ones that are totally assimilated and they don't know nothing about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They're not even familiar with Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. So in days of yore, all were observant, all were Yirei Shamayim. Some were more learned than others. Today, only the learned stayed with us and all the others are just out there nowhere. So anyway, so the Rambam writes, why is there no Chazoros Shatz by Marav? Because by Marav there is no need Lahoitzi es Misha Einoi Boki. If you're not Boki, everything is fine. Tfilas Arvis Rishus. So that is why we don't have Chazoros Shatz by Marav, because Chazal didn't see it as important Lahoitzi es Misha Einoi Boki. You can't be moitzi a person Yidei Chavosa when there is no Chayva. And if Tfilas Arvis Rishus, we don't have a concern, what would all those do that don't know how to daven? It's not a chayvo anyway. So that is the second halacha, which is based on Tfilas Arvis Rishus. And the third halacha writes the Rambam in Perek Yud, halacha vav. Shachas and Mincha, if you started davening Shemoneh Esrei and then suddenly you realized, I already davened, you stop wherever you are. You stop in your tracks and you don't go on, because it's a bracha levatala. But Tfilas Arvis, mi'koralo, is Paral Hashem Chayva, and therefore Tfilas Arvis. If a middle of Shemoneh Esrei you realize, I already davened Marav, so do it again. Because even the first time it's not a Chayva. So there's not much difference between the first time and the second time, the Rambam writes. And that is the third halacha that the Rambam writes, Tfilas Arvis Rishus does make a difference. And that is why there is no Chazor Sashatz. That is Ein Medaktekim Bizmano. And the third halacha, which is a Chiddush of the Rambam, which is not a Gemara, and the third halacha is Shachas and Mincha. If you realize in the middle of davening you're already daven, Brocha Levatola, and you stop, you just walk away in the middle of the Shmoneh Esrei. But Tfilas Arvis Mikora Eineno Chayva, and therefore you could finish your davening.
You have to finish.
What?
You have to finish.
I think you have to. You should not stop in the middle. Let's check the Rambam. You're asking a good question. I think it's mashma medivra Rambam that you should, and not only you could, but you should as well. So Perek Yud Halacha Vav. Let's have a look at the Rambam. Mishan Estapek lo yimisparal lo yisparal. Eino yichoyz v'misparal. Elo mke misparal tefillah lo dash in adava. Misho yoimid tefillah v'niska. V'niskar shekvar yisparal. Poisek afilu b'yemtza brocha. Ve'im hoyset tefillas Arvis. Eino yipoisek. Shelo yisparal lo yisa mitchilo. Elo dash in chayva. So it's mashma ein a poisek that he should finish davening. Not only he could, but he should. And the Ravid disagrees with this halacha. And the Ravid writes, Ein kan nachas ruach. So the Ravid has an interesting way of expressing his disagreements with the Rambam. Sometimes he uses very harsh language. I think this one could be considered as mild. And he writes, Ein kan nachas ruach. I don't like this halacha. And he does not explain why. The Kesef Mishnah says that the Ravid's concern or the Ravid's disagreement is based on the Rambam himself writes Kiblu Aleim Chayva. And if Kiblu Aleim Chayva, it is a Chayva. Mikanu Lahaba. So why would it be different than Shachas and Minchas that are a Chayva? The same would apply to Marev. Fundamentally, what is the difference between Shachas, Mincha, and Marev? You can't have the same Shmoneh Esrei, a combination of Choiva and Nedova. A person is entitled to daven a Tfilas Nedova. But if you daven a Tfilas Nedova, it must be a Nedova mitchila v'tzoy, from beginning to end. So you weren't aware that you davened already. So you started davening the Shmoneh Esrei l'shem Choiva. You can't have a half a Shmoneh Esrei l'shem Choiva and then switch over to Nedova. And therefore the Rambam writes, but Tfilas Marav Mikora was never a Chayva, so you might as well finish L'Shem Nedava. So the Kesef Mishnah writes, the reason the Ravid writes Ein kan nachas ruach, because the Rambam contradicts himself. If the Rambam writes in Perek Aleph that Shaviu Olei Chayva, Kiblu Oleim Chayva, then it would be similar to Shachas and Mincha, which are Chayva, and you cannot combine Chayva and Nedava. That is the explanation of the Kesef Mishnah, why the Ravid is unhappy. So Reb Chaim Brisker says, to be miyashiv the Rambam, and he says, the Chayva, like everything in Brisk, Gavra and Chefze. The Chayva is not the Gavra, but the Chefze is still a Tfilas Rishus, and not a Tfilas Chayva. To use my sprach, my words, Reb Chaim says, Kibel olav Chayva lisparer Tfilas Rishus. Kibel olav Chayva lisparer Tfilas Nedava. The Tfilah B'etzem doesn't change. Kibel and Chayva is on the Gavra. Especially if we say Kibel and Chayva is Medin Neder. So the reason you need to say this Tfilah is because you made a Neder to say. It doesn't change the nature of the Tfilah. And a Tfilas Rishus will always stay a Tfilas Rishus. Kibel olav Chayva litpalel Tfilas Rishus. So Reb Chaim says, Kibel olav Chayva only is Machayev the Gavra. But the Tfilah doesn't change. It doesn't change the nature of the Tfilah. And therefore, the Rambam would maintain this was the dove in the first place, and therefore I could finish davening, because anyway it's a Tfilas Rishus and not a Tfilas Chayva. In my opinion, my interpretation of the Ravid's Sukkah would be different than the Rambam's. And I think what Reb Chaim argues is a svara pshuta. That is not what bothers the Ravid. If the Ravid would be troubled because Kibbron Lehem Choiva, the Ravid would say so. And in most cases, when I learn Rambam and Ravid, and whenever the Ravid writes a Suga on the Rambam without explaining what his Suga is, it must be something very fundamental, something very basic, and the Ravid doesn't feel I need to explain. So the way I would understand the Ravid, Nedova and Rishus are two different concepts. Tfilis Rishus is not Tfilis Nedova. Tfilis Nedova is voluntary. Tfilis Rishus is a different concept. Ein Tfilis Nedova b'Shabbos. But we daven Ma'arav on Shabbos, even though Tfilis Arav is Rishus. So Rishus is not Nedova. Both are not obligatory, but it's a different concept. And therefore the Rav says, just like Choiva and Nedova don't mix, Rishus and Nedova don't mix. So according to the Rav, Tfilis Rishus does not mean Tfilis Nedova. And the biggest proof is we daven Ma'arav on Shabbos, B'Leil Shabbos. There is no Tfilis Nedova on Shabbos. And the reason there is no Tfilis Nedova on Shabbos brings us back to the beginning of today's Shiur. Tfilis Keneged Korbonos. There are no Korbonos Nedova on Shabbos. You can't bring a Korban Nedova on Shabbos, it's Chilul Shabbos. Only Korban Asibar Doicha Shabbos. And just like there is no Korban Nedova on Shabbos, there is no Tfilis Nedova on Shabbos, and we still daven Ma'arav B'Leil Shabbos. So Rishus and Nedova are not the same concept, and I think that is what bothers the Ravid, and therefore the Ravid doesn't even need to explain. What is the difference between Shachas and Mincha and Ma'arav? You can't have half a davening Nedova, while the other half, the first half, was Choiva or Rishus. That would be my understanding. And maybe the Rambam L'Shitosoi, Perek Gimel, Halacha Gimel. So today we're quoting so many Rambams, then I would open up the Rambam, and this is, it's going to be a chiddush to most of you. And the Rambam writes that there was a minig b'yamei kedem that people davened mincha twice every day, mincha gedola and mincha ketana. And this is an entire siman in Shulchan Aruch. Kosev Rambam. Nago anoshim harbe l'spalel gedoyle v'ktana v'achas rishus. If you daven 2 minchas every day, then one of the two must be a tfilas rishus. Can't be tfilas choiva, because there definitely is no obligation and no chiyuv to daven 2 minchas. It's either mincha gedoyle or mincha ketana. But the Rambam writes. Nagu anoshim harbe l'spalel gedoyle v'ktana v'achas rishus. What does the Rambam mean, hu achas rishus? He definitely means nedova. It's not like tfilas arvis rishus. If you daven 2 tfilas, nedova. So the Rambam says nedova and rishus are actually one and the same. And therefore the Rambam l'shitosoi, every tfilas arvis is nedova. So why not finish b'nedova? The Ravid would argue, no, Rishus and Nedova are 2 different concepts. But we see in this Rambam, he calls Nedova Rishus. V'hoiru mixes hagoinim, she'ein re'ui l'spal Rishus elo ha'gedoylo, mincha gedoylo. V'chein adinoisid, mepnei shu keneged dova she'eino itoda b'kol yom. V'im ispal ha'gedoylo choyva, no ispal ha'ktana, ele Rishus. So there's a machlokes between Gedoyle Sfarad and Gedoyle Ashkenaz. Those people that daven 2 tefillas every day, 2 minchas every day, 1 choiva, 1 nedova. Which one would be choiva? Which one would be nedova? So the Rambam says mincha gedoyla would be the reshus, mincha ketana would be the choiva. Why would mincha gedoyla be reshus? Because mincha gedoyla is connected a tumid of Erev Yom Tov and Erev Pesach, which was very early, because they needed to bring 1,000 Korban Pesach, and that is not every day. Every day Tumid Shel Bein Avayim was late in the afternoon, and therefore Mincha Gedolah should be Rishus. The Rosh, in Shuvas Rosh argues, you can never daven Nedova when you have a Choiv. Nedava can only come after chayva. When you are mechuyev in Tfilas Mincha, you can't daven in Nedava when you have a chayva. Just like Tfilas Tashlumin is always the second tefillah. First, you need the Tfilas chayva. So the Rambam calls Nedava Rishus. Rambam Nishitos, Tfilas Avos Rishus. And even though you realize in the middle of davening you already davened Marav, you could finish B'Toras Nedava. Because Rishus and Nedava are almost the same concept, and that would be my understanding in the Machlokes, the Rambam and Ramban. Sof Perek Aleph of Hilchos Tefillah, the Rambam writes that there are many halachas in Hilchos Tefillah which are based on the fact that the three tefillahs we daven every day coincide with the korbanos. And that is at the end of Perek Aleph, Mehilchos Tefillah. And primarily, three halachas. Nimtzau atfilah shebekol yom shalosh. Arves shachris v'mincha. Tfilas elu, ein poichsen aleihem, aval masifan aleihem. Im rotza odem l'spal kol yom rishus v'yodoi. V'kol otam atfilot sheyosif, kamo makriv nedavois. Just like there are nedorim and nedavois. So you could daven more than three tefillas. Lefichach, tzorach sheyeh chadash dova b'kol brocha v'brocha b'nem tzois me'en ha'brochis. V'mchidash afil brocha, achas dayoi, kedei lo idia, she tefillas nedova v'lo choiva. And then the Rambam goes on. Ein hatzibur mispalin tefillas nedova. Lefi she'ein hatzibur mevi'en korban nedova. Korbanos nedova are always from individuals. Korban Sibur, there's no such a thing as an Nedava. Korban and Sibur are Shnei Tamidim B'Kol Yom, Musafin, and Shabbos and Yom Tov. So there is no Korban Sibur, which is a Nedava, and therefore, individuals could daven Tfilas Nedava, but not the Tzibur. V'lo yispar afilu yochid Musaf Shtayim, achas choyves yom v'achas Nedava, lefi she'ein misnadven Korban Musaf. Korban Musaf is only choyva. And the third halacha is, yesh min hagoyim mishahoira, she'osa l'spar Tfilas Nedava b'Shabbos v'yom tovim, lefi she'ein makrivim behen Nedava, elo choyves hayom bilvad. So three halachas that Rambam writes are based on the comparison, Tfilas, keneged korbanos tiknom. Shabbos, Musaf, and Sibur, these do not have Tfilas Nedava. So the Rambam, the way I would understand it, Rishus and Nedava are similar. And that is why the Rambam writes, Yesh Misha Hoira. It's not a milta de Pshita. She'oseh l'spalat Tfilas Nedava b'Shabbos v'yomim tovim. Because we do find Marav, Rishus. So the Machlokes Rambam and Ravid would be, are there three different concepts regarding Tfilas? Chayva, Rishus, Nedava? Or are Rishus and Nedava fundamentally the same concept? And I will deal a few minutes with a very relevant question. Tfilah b'tzibur, is Tfilah b'tzibur a chayva or a zgula? Is it a chiyuv komet to daven with a minyan? Or it's just the right thing to do because the only guarantee you have that your tefillas will be niskabel is if you daven with a minyan. The lesson of the Shulchan Aruch in Hilchos Tefillah Siman Tzadik Sif Tet is Yishtadel ha'odam le'isparel be'beis hakneses im hatzibur. This lesson, Yishtadel ha'odam, seems to indicate it's not really a choiva, it's not an obligation, it's the right thing to do. And the Vayeitzei follows in the footsteps of the Tur. The Tur writes, Yishtadel bekol koichoi lispalel im hatzibur bebeis hakneses. So the Vayeitzei seems to water it down a bit. The Tur writes, Yishtadel bekol koichoi. Shulchan Aruch writes, Yishtadel. It's not because the Shulchan Aruch doesn't think it's so important, but anybody that is familiar with the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch knows that the Vayeitzei made a tremendous effort to be mekatzer, to be as concise as possible and as short as possible. It is an interesting phenomenon. The Shulchan Aruch was printed many times during the lifetime of the Beis Yosef. In the second publication, the Beis Yosef split the Shulchan Aruch into 30 days. Just like every Tehillim that you pick up is split into 30 days. And the Shulchan Aruch, the Beis Yosef, expected everyone to go through Dalet Chelke Shulchan Aruch every month. And therefore, he divided Dalet Shulchan Aruch into 30 days. In the third print, it is no longer there. I think people told the Beis Yosef, what's wrong with you? Do you think this is realistic? Do you think anybody will go through a Dalet Shulchan Aruch every month? Be realistic. Be realistic. And that was before we had the Magen Avraham and the Taz and the Shach and the Sma and the Shach and the Taz and Yoredeya. But it is clear that the Beis Yosef makes an effort to be as short as possible. And many times when he quotes the Rambam or the Tur, he omits even a few words. But the lesson of the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch is Yishtadel, which seems to indicate it is not really a choive gemuro. And the Rambam, Perek Daled, Aloha Aleph, I think it's Perek Ches Aloha Aleph, the Rambam in Hilchos Tefillah, the lesson of the Rambam is Tfilas HaTzibur Nishmas Tomid, Afilu Ayu Behem Chotim, Ein HaKodesh Baruch Hu Moyes B'Tfilosam Shel Rabim, Lefichach צורך קודם לשתף עצמו עם הציבור, ולא יספר ביוחד כל זמן שיוכל לספר עם הציבור. Does this Rambam prove it's a chiyuv, or it is not a chiyuv? For some reason, Reb Moshe Feinstein takes out of this Rambam the davening with the minyan is a chiyuv. Two tshuvas in Niggas Moshe, Oira Chaim, Chelik Beisim Achov Zayin, and Chelik Beisim Achov Zayin, Chelik Gimel, Simen Zayin, and Reb Moshe says, Lefichach, I think the Rambam proves the opposite, and the Rambam explains why is it so important to daven with a minyan, because Tfilas HaTzibur Nishmas Tomid Ve'ein HaKodesh Baruch Hu Moyes B'Tfilosam Shel Rabim, and therefore tzodech Odom Mishad V'lo Yisparal B'Yochad Kol Zman Sheyochel L'Sparal Im HaTzibur. That means if you could have a minyan, don't daven b'yachidus. What do you mean if you could have a minyan? You need to see to it that you have a minyan. So I think both the Rambam and the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch seem to indicate Tefillah B'Tzibur is not a chiyuv. It's a zgula, it's a maila. If you're a sensible person, that is what you want to do. Because especially in our day and age when our kavona is so compromised, if you want your tefillah to have an effect, and you want to have some level of confidence that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will answer your tefillahs, then daven with a minyan. And that is actually what the Rambam and the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch seem to be saying. So the Moshe argues, Psochim Mem Vav, which is a Sif in Shulchan Aruch, Simen Tzadik Tet Zayin, prove that it's a chiyuv, legabel, veletfilah, velenatilas yadayim, ad daled mil. What does tefillah mean? But the Gemara says for three things you need to go out of your way and walk daled mil. Daled mil is, let's say, approximately a mile, or a bit less than a mile. So Rashi says, if you need to walk daled mil to daven with a minyan, that is what you need to do. Toises pshat is, if you need to walk daled mil to have mayim lenatilis yadayim before davening, that is what you need to do. Shulchan Aruch paskins in accordance to Rashi. You need to walk daled mil to have a minyan. So the Moshe says this proves that it's a chiyuv gamo. Maybe not. After all, everybody agrees it is what you should be doing. So the Gemara, according to Rashi, quoted by the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch, say you should be walking daled mil. If it's more than daled mil, that is maybe too much to expect, unless it's a real midas chasidus. So the Moshe proves from this halacha that it is a chiyuv. But there are a few other sugyas which I think would prove the contrary. No, the chiyuv would be davening with a minyan. When you daven with a minyan, then Kaddish and Kedusha is part of the davening. But the chiyuv upon the individual is more davening with a minyan. Daf Lamed Amud Beis, the Gemara says, Rav Ame v'Rav Asi daven the Beini Amude de Garse Berabanan. They preferred to daven in the Beis Medrash where they learned, and they didn't go to shul. In days of yore, both the Knesias and both the Midrashas were not one and the same. Both the Knesias were designated for davening, and both the Midrashas for learning. Today, Baruch Hashem, there are so many Lamdei Torah. Every Beis Knesset is a Beit Midrash, every Beis Medrash is a Beis Knesset. But when you visit old shuls, especially in Europe, there's a beautiful, what they call in modern language, the sanctuary where you daven, and then there's a little shtibel outside, and that was the Beis Medrash, because not that many people stay to learn. But today, Baruch Hashem, both the Knesset and both the Midrashas are almost always the same. But Rav Ame v'Rav Asi didn't go to shul, and they preferred to daven in the Beis Medrash. Machlokes Tosfos and Rambam. Tosfos says they prefer to daven b'yechidus, where they learned, and not to go to the Beis Knesset, to the shul, to daven with a minyan. The Rambam says it's preferable to daven in a Beis Medrash where people learn Torah, but only if you have a minyan. If you don't have a minyan, go to the Beis Knesset. Would the machlokes be whether minyan is a chiyuv or not? Not necessarily. I think the pshat of Tosfos proves that davening with a minyan is not a chiyuv, because the mala yaser of a Beis Medrash, which has more kedusha than the Beis Knesset, wouldn't override a chiyuv gomer. But the Rambam would not prove the contrary. The Rambam doesn't prove that it's a chiyuv to daven with a minyan. But it definitely is a gula. It definitely is the right thing to do. The Rambam writes, "Lefichach tzorech ha'odam lesparal im hatzibur," and that mila overrides the added value of davening in a Beis Medrash. But the opinion of those poskim that say daven b'yechidus in a Beis Medrash and it's preferable to daven with a minyan in shul definitely prove davening with a minyan is not a chiyuv. Mishnah Brura, Siman Samach Vav Siv Kot Mem, deals with the question. The Gemara says, "Akoyre kriya shema belit tefillin is kamayid edus sheker." And the Mishnah Brura deals with the question, I don't have tefillin yet. Somebody is supposed to bring me tefillin, but I have a minyan right now. Do I daven with a minyan without tefillin, and then I'll put on tefillin and say kriya shema? Or should I wait and daven b'yechidus with tefillin? Mishnah Brura paskins, wait, you're going to daven b'yechidus with tefillin, and it is preferable to daven with a minyan without tefillin. If davening with a minyan would be a chiyuv, this psak doesn't make sense. Being mevatel a chiyuv gomer to daven with tefillin, you're going to get tefillin later, and you're going to say kriya shema with your tefillin. So it won't be meyadei the sheker. So I think that these halachas prove that davening with a minyan is not a chiyuv, but it definitely is an important segula. The Mogad Avraham in Hilchas Chanukah, and it's almost Chanukah, Tov Reish Ayin Aleph, and it'll take me too much time to explain how does this halacha fit into Chanukah. It's the sugya of Chashdo. Bayis sheyesh lo shnei psochim, Beit Knesset sheyesh lo shnei psochim. Brochas Daf Ches, vice versa, the Gemara in Shabbos Chov Gimel. The Mogadam writes, when a person is torud ba'asokov, doesn't need to daven with the minyan. If he's busy with his business, doesn't need to daven with the minyan. Why not? If it's a chiyuv, would anybody say Torah Basokov doesn't need to come to Mikra Megillah? Torah Basokov doesn't need to light Ner Chanukah? These are mitzvahs derabanan. Torah Basokov doesn't need to daven at all. because the three tefillahs are midirabanan. And mitzvah derabanan, you have no ptur tored basakov. And the Mughal writes, tored basakov doesn't need that with a minyan. So I think davening with a minyan is the right thing to do. Now, I don't want anybody to walk out of the shul tonight with a feeling, so it's not that important to daven with a minyan. No, it is extremely important. And it is what good Jews do and should keep on doing. So I don't want anybody to walk out because then I'm going to bear responsibility. And I do not want that responsibility. Davening with opinion is important. It is extremely important. And that is why the Torah writes, B'kol koichoy, yishtadel b'kol koichoy. But there is an afka min el halacha, whether it is a chiyuv or a mala, yesera, and a zgula for kabbalas atfilah. Yeah, that definitely would be one of the sources to our discussion. Rabbi Eliezer freed his slave to be mitzarefim to minyan. So the Rosh writes, it was the kri of Parshas Zohar, which is a chi of the Uraisa. Otherwise, he wouldn't be Meshachar the Eved. But others write, and that's the Rashba, Lo oilem ben tavoido is like lo sechonim. And if I have personal interest in freeing a slave, that would not be an Aveda. That would be permissible. But that sugi in Brochas Mem Zayin is definitely one of the sugis which we should be discussing in this discussion. So today, we spoke about Tefillah, and primarily about Tefillah's Marav, this week's Parsha, Yaakov Avinu Tikkun Arvis. So when Chazal teach us that the Ovis Ekdoshim Tiknu Shachris Mincha Marav, there are many different interpretations. What do these three tefillahs mean? The Maharal in Nesiva Soilam, in Nesiva Tefillah, has a lengthy mahalach, which is in the style of the Maharal, and he says that these tefillahs are keneged v'ahavto et Hashem elechecha b'chol levavcho v'chol nafshecho v'chol moedecho. Lev, nefesh, money, b'chol levavcho v'chol nafshecho moedecho, are keneged shachris mincha marav. A bit complicated. The Mabit has a sefer which is Musar Hasidus named Beis Elokim in Shar HaTfilah. He writes that the three tefillahs, Shachas Mincha Marav, are keneged Yemei Chayav Sharadam. Shachas, when you open your eyes in the morning, that is keneged your younger years, your formative years. How important it is when you're young to just set your sights on the right path in emun in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and betochen, and turning to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and davening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then mincha is when you start feeling old, or your midlife crisis. Don't forget to turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Marav is in your elderly years. And the Mabit says these three tefillahs coincide with three different stages in the life of every individual. I saw somewhere in Sifrei Drush and Sifrei Remez the second letter of the name of the Avos is keneged the tefillah that they put into place. The second letter of Avram is a Beis, and that is Boiker. Second letter of Yitzchak is a Tzadik, and that is Tzohorayim. The second letter of Yankov is a Ayin, and that is Arvis. Keneged Posuk and Tehillim, Erev Uvoiker v'Tzohorayim, Osicho v'Ohemo. So the Posuk says Erev Boker v'Tzohorayim, and that is the second letter of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yankov. So my feeling is, it is not only, morning, afternoon, night. Each of the Avos was matakan tefillah lefi nafshoy or lefi midoisav, and it had to do with the personality and the midah of that one of the Ovis HaKdoshim. Avram is Chesed. Titan Chesed LaAvram. And in Kabbalah we know that Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes are Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Lahagid baboiker chasdecha ve'emunascha balaylos. Boker, you get up in the morning, the sun comes up on the earth and it gives its light, it gives its warmth. Those are the days of clarity. Those are the days of chesed. Lahagid baboiker chasdecha, and that belongs to Avram. Titan chesed Avram. Avram was the Amoid chesed. So it is well known from the Zohar that Midas Adin Misgaberes b'mincha. Mincha is the time of Midas Adin. And that is the power of Yitzchak, Pachad Yitzchak. Yitzchak is Midas Adin, as we find in the Zohar. Yankov Tikkun Arvis, I think last week we discussed, Yankov paved the way for Klal Yisrael Ha'orach HaGolus. And that is why Yankov Tikkun Arvis. B'divrei Hanavi, night always means Golus. Shomer Mameleil. Nafshi L'Shem is Shomer L'Boikar. The watchman is all night. And night is a scary time. And he waits for sunrise. And Klal Yisrael waits for Shachar Shel Moshiach. This night has been too long for us. This Golus has been too long. And Yankov is the one that paved the way for Klal Yisrael and Golus and guaranteed that we make it through this long Golus. And that is why Yankov Tikkun Arvis. So Avram, Yitzchak, and Yankov. Avram is Chesed and Yitzchak is Gevuras. And Yankov had the special power and the special koyach to prepare Klal Yisrael and give us the strength to endure and to make it through this long night till Keitz Hayamin, and that is why the others were metakan these three tefillas. And al shloishet dvorim ha'olam oimed ala Torah va'ala avoda va'al gemilas chesodim, and avoda means tefillah, ezu avoda shebelev zu tefillah. So tefillah is one of the most important yesodis to avoda, and it is so important that the most intimate act of all the mitzvahs, the closest you could get to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is by talking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and believing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu listens to your tefillahs and He responds. So in Brachas Avav, the Gemara is mafarash HaPosek in Tehillim, Kerum Zuris Lebnei Yodam, Dvorim Oim de Berum Shaloilam, Vebnei Yodam Ezalzelam Behem. And the Baal Shem Tov explained the Gemara. Why are people mezalzel in tefillah? Because we all had this feeling more than once in our lives. Sometimes a family member, a loved one is desperately ill, and you're down from the depth of your heart. And you come together by the koisel, and the family cries and cries out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and sometimes it doesn't happen. And sometimes people feel, what did our tefillahs achieve? Where did they go? And the Baal Shem Tov says, every tefillah that is said with kavanah is dvorim ha'oimdoi berum shaloilam. They all go up to the Kisei HaKavod. No tefillah sinks into oblivion, and no tefillah goes unheard, and no real tefillah goes unanswered. But we may never know how HaKadosh Baruch Hu answers our tefillahs. He knows what is good, and He knows what is to our benefit. And a person might daven for riches, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives him life. He davens for one thing, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives him another. But we need to believe. Dvorim ha'oimdim berumah shaloilam. Every tefillah that comes out of a lev tohar with proper kavanah goes up to the Kisei HaKavod. And they all make a difference. Not always would we know how our tefillahs were answered and what our tefillahs achieved. But it is all Devorim ha'oimdim berumah shaloilam. And the Gemara says, it's paralodem v'lo ne'ana. Ma yaseh? Yachzor v'yisparal, shenemar, kaveh el Hashem, chazak v'yamitz libecho, v'kaveh el Hashem. Your tefillahs weren't answered first time, daven again. Daven again and again and again, and believe that HaKadosh Baruch Hu listens to your tefillas, and in a way that you might never really appreciate and understand, He answers your tefillas. So tefillah is one of the most important yesodas of avodas HaKeil. Yerotzon, that our tefillah should always be in a skabel, and we should be zoicha bekolim in the schus of the Oves HaKdoshim to see Pnei Moshiach Tzedkeinu b'mheru v'yomeinu. Amen.